Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of our Comic Lab podcast. In today's episode, we're going to talk about Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis, and today's episode is called Black, White, and In Between. Today, we're diving into Persepolis, which is a graphic comic that does much more than recount childhood memories of the Iranian Revolution. The author transforms the comic page into a space where trauma, identity, and political repression collide, where the smallest changes in line, shading, and panel structure reveal how a young girl learns to resist, adapt, and reconstruct herself. So, my working thesis for this episode is that Marjane Satrapi uses visual symbolism and the stark simplicity of black and white art to express resistance and self-destruction. Through the interplay of absence and presence, what is drawn and what is left blank, Satrapi portrays how political repression fragments memory and identity. The research question guiding today's analysis is: how does Persepolis use visual language to represent trauma and identity formation under political repression? To explore this question, I'll draw on insights from scholar Ben Lander, who argues that memory literally shapes the visual form of Satrapi's comic. He explains that Satrapi's page layouts, her use of enlarged or fragmented panels, and even moments of humor all reflect the emotional weight of her lived experiences. Lander writes that Satrapi's shapes her panels according to their importance in her memory. Moments of private trauma and thought fill much of the book. This idea of Lander becomes crucial in understanding Persepolis as a visual autobiography of memory and not just a narrative one. Let's begin by looking at how Satrapi uses visuals, minimalism, and symbolism as tools for representing oppression. So first of all, let's start talking about the veil, which is in the first chapter. So one of the first panels that establishes Satrapi's visual language appears early in the veil. A large half-page panel shows children at school, where they are confused and exaggerating their reactions to the newly imposed veil. The simplicity of the drawings, thin lines, open white space creates a contrast between innocence and the political violence that structures their lives. This panel exemplifies what Lander notes when he describes Satrapi's use of humor as a coping mechanism and critique. He points to the scene where a girl ties together several veils into a jump rope, calling attention to the absurdity of a rule forced onto children. This white panel slows down the movement, almost freezing it in time, representing both confusion and resistance. It's an act of visual presence. The veil is everywhere in the frame, but also a moment of personal agency. Because the children transform a symbol of control into a toy, the absence of shading and background detail pushes us to focus on the veil itself. Its visual dominance symbolizes how political repression imposes itself onto Margie's emerging identity. I'm also going to talk about how trauma as fragmented memory. In page 142, there's a powerful example of Satrapi portraying trauma through visual fragmentation. It appears in a scene after the bombing of the Baba Levy family's house, where Margie turns a corner and sees her friend's bracelet still attached to a disembodied arm beneath the rubble. The page breaks into small, irregular panels that feel claustrophobic. Here, Satrapi uses the absence of the body. We see only the arm and the bracelet to evoke this trauma more intensely than any detailed depiction of violence could. The stark black and white style removes the distraction of realism, forcing the reader onto Margie's psychological shock. This panel directly connects to Lander's argument about spatial manipulation, where he states, Satrapi's often extends a panel horizontally, conveying the complexity and relative importance of different moments in Satrapi's life. But here she does the opposite. She compresses the panels, mirroring how trauma constricts memory. The tension between what is shown and what is withheld, the presence and the absence, represents how traumatic memory is incomplete, fragmented, and overwhelming. This fragmentation becomes part of Margie's identity formation. It marks the end of childhood innocence, the beginning of this political consciousness, and a deep internalization of loss. Now I'm going to talk about rebellion through visual symbolism. There's an example of this in page 131, where in contrast to moments of trauma, Satrapi also uses visual symbolism to express resistance and self-determination. One memorable example is the page where her parents return from Turkey with Western gifts, like a denim jacket and Nike sneakers and some posters. The panel in which Margie wears her new jacket in public is composed with bold black areas and sharp contrasts. The heavy ink around her figure makes her stand out against the gray uniform world enforced by the state. The detailed rendering of the jacket compared to the minimal background turns the clothing into a symbol of identity formation, a statement that cannot be spoken aloud. Here, the author uses presence, the exaggerated attention to the jacket, of course, to symbolize individuality. And she also uses absence with the lack of crowd detail or setting to highlight how her sense of self is becoming internal and kind of rebellious. This moment represents a very important theme, which is that identity is not only shaped by repression, but also reconstructed through everyday acts of small resistance. And I'm also going to talk about another example in page 70 and 71, which is a horizontal panel and slow passage into her adulthood. One of the most emotionally intense uses of Lander's observation about this extended horizontal panels comes during the sequence of Anusha's execution. The elongated image of Margie is lying in bed after hearing the news fills the width of the page. The black and white background isolates her, visually enacting the collapse of her inner world. By stretching the panel, the author slows down time. It becomes a moment the reader must dwell in, mirroring Margie's profound grief. This technique embodies what Lander describes when he writes that Satrapi uses panel structure to, and I quote, to convey the complexity and relative importance of different moments. In this scene, the empty background space represents absence, not just emotional emptiness, but the erasure of political dissidents, the silencing of voices like Anusha's. This interplay of presence and absence becomes the foundation of her identity formation under repression. Now, talking about another secondary source, just like Satrapi, Art Spiegelman uses stark black and white imagery to depict historical violence in the comic Mouse. But he also employs symbolic abstractions such as animal identities to visualize the dehumanization and psychological distortion caused by oppression. Both authors manipulate panel structure to mirror the instability of memory. In Mouse, for example, Spiegelman often overlaps past and present within the same frame, while Satrapi alternates between expansive panels and compressed, chaotic ones to evoke emotional rupture. In conclusion, as we trace Margie's journey through Persepolis, one thing becomes clear. As Satrapi uses the visual language of comics, with panel size, negative space, symbolic contrasts, and all of this black and white imagery to represent the complexity of growing up under this political repression that Margie goes through. Trauma fragments memory, rebellion reconstructs identity, And through this tension, Satrapi shows how a young girl learns to navigate a world that constantly attempts to silence her. Ben Lander's insights help us understand that Persepolis is not simply a memoir, it is a visual map of memory, where the architecture of the page becomes a form of storytelling itself. Ultimately, Persepolis portrays how identity is never fixed, it is continually reshaped in response to resistance and rupture. Satrapi invites us to see history not as distant, but as something lived and something drawn. Thank you very much for listening to this podcast. I'll see you in the next one.